Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to this session, the final session in the cybercrime course, the encryption debate, fighting cybercrime, protecting national security and safeguarding rights, all in 1 hour and 20 minutes. Just to let you know that this session will be held on the record, and you can comment on Twitter using the hashtag cyberspace for all. That's the number 4. And as with previous sessions, you are very much encouraged to submit questions through the Q&A function on your environment. We are live streaming, and viewers who aren't in the Zoom webinar can comment and ask questions using that same hashtag, the cyberspace for all. So let me first introduce our fantastic panelists for today, all representing different points on the spectrum, I suppose, of views in relation to encryption, the protection of rights and privacy, and lawful access to content. So we have Ian Drennan, who's the Executive Director of We Protect Global Alliance, and he's been there since its launch as an independent organisation last year. Previously, he was working in the Home Office's international response to child sexual abuse. Prior to this, Ian worked in national security, foreign policy and counter-terrorism roles within the UK civil service and diplomatic service, including a posting to Kabul, where he managed the UK's multi-million-dollar counter-terrorism and anti-corruption justice programme. Thank you. Welcome to you, Ian. Kieran Martin is a Professor of Practice in the Management of Public Organisations at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. Prior to joining the school, he was the founding Chief Executive of the UK's National Cyber Security Centre, or NCSC, which is part of GCHQ, the UK Signal Intelligence Unit. Kieran has held senior roles within Cabinet Office, including Constitution Director from 2011 to 2014, Director of Security Intelligence at the Cabinet Office, and as Principal Private Secretary to the Cabinet Secretary and Head of the Civil Service, and Private Secretary to the Permanent Secretary to the HM Treasury, which sounds like a Gilbert and Sullivan song, doesn't it? And I'd love to see that on a business card. We then have Maria Luisa Stasi, or Isa. She's a lawyer at Article 19. She's their senior legal officer, and she's held that role since 2018. She's based in London, contributes to the development of Article 19's policies on infrastructure, competition, regulatory framework in this area, and also provides legal support to the organisation's regional offices. Last but not least is Stephen Wilson, Stevie, CEO of the Cyber Defence Alliance, which is a not-for-profit partnership that works mainly with the financial sector and law enforcement to share information on cybercrime and emerging threats. Stevie was previously head of Europol's European Cybercrime Centre, the EC3. So we have an amazingly experienced and diverse panel here for you today to really get the conversation started. And I think it's really appropriate that Chatham House have organised this training session as a panel rather than a direct teaching. This does seem to be an area where the sort of views are very polarised, but before we get onto that discussion and maybe trying to find some common ground and think about how to move forward in a coherent way, maybe we can just sort of set the scene a bit. Kieran, can I start with you? What do we mean by encryption, and you know, what are the trends and the implications for policy that you're seeing from your role and your former role at NCSC? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that introduction. Hi, everyone, and thanks for organising this event. And actually, whilst I think you've given me quite a difficult job in some ways, you've given me the most pleasant job, because this is, as you said, a very polarised debate, a very important debate. It's really good to have it in this type of forum with real experts. And by giving me the chance to set out the issue, I might get it wrong. And Ian, Maria, and Stevie are very welcome to correct anything that they feel I've got wrong technically. But actually, I find this a really, really difficult set of public policy choices. And so I think I'm actually really keen to listen to the contributions of others. So I'll try and set out the issue as fairly as possible. We are talking about a very ancient capability that has polarized a very modern digital environment. I mean, encryption is essentially securing communications. It involves the use of cryptography, which directly translates from the ancient language as secret writing. You can say very crudely that we've had 4 phases of encryption over the centuries. We've had a sort of classic encryption where people write code and they lock it as best they can, and metaphorically and sometimes literally. In classic encryption, you needed what was called symmetrical keys. In other words, you would lock it at one end. You can Google this under the so-called Alice and Bob metaphor. And the recipient of the message would have to have an identical key at the other end. Now, this was extremely complex. I suppose one could say it reached its apogee in the story of the code breaking on Enigma, where the cryptography had become so strong that, in essence, the predecessors of GCHQ, with others, as well as cracking the maths, more or less built what many regard as the world's first functioning computer in order to do the computation to break the encryption. What's interesting for me about that story is all sorts of interesting things about that story, but for this debate, I think it's the sort of final phase, if you like, or the beginning of the final phase, where encryption and secret communications were the preserve of governments. There are only people who could afford to do this sort of thing at a very serious and complex level. It was done for national security, for interstate conflict, and so on. So the act of doing effective encryption and breaking it essentially belonged to governments. That begins to change in the second phase in the 1970s with the introduction and the discovery of something called public key cryptography. The full story of that is only emerging in recent years, and it's fascinating because some people, one of whom is still alive, in GCHQ actually discovered how to do asymmetrical cryptography. In other words, you didn't need the exact key, so you could popularize it. But GCHQ, in effect, partly because I think they just knew that the consequences of such a discovery were so profound, sort of sat on it, and eventually 2 US academics, Diffie and Hellman, developed cryptography in a way that now powers banking transactions and all sorts of things, where it's, anyone can have their own key, it's verified and so forth, but there still is, and this is crucial for this debate, a central mechanism where, the data transits through. So in effect, the use of cryptography becomes not just available, but necessary to the population as large as the digital economy becomes online. But then phase 3, although we didn't really know it at the time, is as the digital economy rises in the 90s and noughties, there are huge flows of data between different countries, and of course, global intelligence services and others become very interested in this. It's particularly after 9/11, and a lot of it isn't subject to encryption. And later, as revealed by Edward Snowden, amongst others, there is sort of bulk collection of unencrypted data. And this fuels the fourth phase, which is, I think, what we're actually talking about for a large part of this debate. It fuels something that's already technically possible and in practice, but not really implemented in huge form, something called end-to-end encryption, where it changes everything in terms of device A communicates with device B over a network and service, but there is no key. So there is no central way of gathering the data. Now, there are all sorts of legal and political controversies in that others will want to touch on. I'm not going to touch on those in the interests of time. You asked me to set out the underlying background, but just a few reflections perhaps then to tee up the debate. I think there are two reasons why this, there are two sort of philosophical reasons and then several practical reasons why this has become such a difficult and polarized debate. One is, and I have a lot of sympathy with this view, as someone who used to run something called a National Cybersecurity Centre, the essence of modern life is such that, you know, all our access to secure communication is really quite important. Whatever the British government, for whom I worked until recently, whatever its views on some of the things that we'll go on to discuss about, we had several hundred recommendations on the NCSC website, in my view, about the appropriate use of encryption, and strongly advised it for most people in most situations. So it was very much something that modern security and prosperity depended on. On the other hand, I think there is a way in which it has posed a key challenge to the power of governments. That's practically, but first sort of philosophically, if you look at the original charter of the Royal Mail from Cromwellian times in the 1650s, essentially it says, if anybody makes any form of lawful communication under the terms licensed by the English state, then with a warrant, the government can, with a valid warrant, the government can intercept those communications. And with end-to-end encryption, so the argument goes, that becomes technically impossible. If something's end-to-end encrypted, you can't serve a warrant on the service provider to provide it for you. If you keep the analogy with the postal service, you, as well as intercepting or serving a warrant on the individual recipient of a letter, you could serve a warrant on the distributing authorities and go and search a sorting office. There is no sorting office to search in this eventuality. So you can see why there are consequences for the powers of government. And this leads to what can sometimes be a really quite unpleasant and toxic debate, which is why I think it's welcome in these forums. So initially, and at the start of my GCHQ career, there were concerns about the impact of that on counterterrorism. Actually now, as per the subject of this, more and more we're talking about child protection. Intelligence agencies, you know, the other way, people can characterize the history of secret intelligence detection of secure communications is that it's kind of cat and mouse. You know, the bad people invent ways of communications, the state catches up. The bad people use other ways of, and the state catches up. And in counterterrorism, I think it's a strong case for saying that by and large, the state did catch up. But clearly, there are very serious concerns about what the end-to-end encryption of particular platforms, and no doubt others will mention which ones they're concerned about, would lead to serious deprecation of the state's ability to do proper law enforcement against child sexual online exploitation. On the other hand, there is a very legitimate argument on the other side, which is end-to-end encryption, which is used by many people in national security and many people at the top of government for very obvious reasons, is something that cannot be uninvented, and any adaptation to it cannot just be done for the purposes of those particular efforts, such as countering child sexual exploitation. If you make something scrapable or decipherable, literally, by law enforcement, then you do the same for authoritarian regimes or whatever. There is no such way of doing it. So you can see why the debate matters. You can also see why you can see why there are quite sort of heated allegations thrown around. On the one hand, there are allegations that this is just another way of governments wishing to restore the pre-Snowden period of having access to most things most of the time. So the characterization goes. On the other hand, and, you know, there is, I think, sometimes a sense on the pro-privacy side of the debate that governments are overdoing emotive subjects like child protection in order to essentially to facilitate this wider case. On the other hand, every serious law enforcement professional I've talked to is genuinely worried about this. And moreover, there is a governance concern, which is, you know, why should large American or other platforms be taking major public policy decisions essentially away from democratic societies? Finally, I think there is no getting away, though, from things beyond my capabilities on the technical side. So if you look very closely, and because of the noise, not a lot of people do this, if you look very closely at, say, the British government's position, the latest position as articulated by the Home Secretary is they're seeking to preserve the integrity of end-to-end encryption whilst allowing targeted law enforcement access for serious crime. And the question, frankly, is that possible? Because plenty of people say that it isn't. There's just no way of doing it. So whether that's Apple's new, now suspended proposal for what's called client-side scanning, which others could explain, whether it's something called quorum key escrow, where somebody holds a key in trust, others will say, but of course there's still a key, or whether there's just a general duty to, if you like, fulfill the Cromwellian mandate of, look, there has to be a way of allowing targeted access. It's just not possible to do it for good, lawfully constituted British or European or American police forces, but not in a way that you can't do it for brutal authoritarian regimes. And I think there is an aspect for that where, we need to decide and try and inch towards some sort of a consensus as to whether that's possible. And if it isn't, then have an honest conversation about some really serious public policy trade-offs. Thank you very much.
That's a great scene setter for us, Kieran, and lots of elements that I think that we'll be developing further in the debate. You've described this debate as quite toxic, and how encryption challenges the balance of power between governments and these big corporations, but also that this is never a static issue. That it is one of those sort of cat and mouse things where different sides catch up at different times. I mean, I hope we'll have time to look ahead with things like quantum at the end of this. As we look ahead, what's going to happen to encryption? Is that going to motivate a lot of hoarding of encrypted content in the expectation that it can be decrypted? But can I turn to you now, Isa? I mean, Kieran noted the widespread use and utility of encryption online, that NCSC, the National Cybersecurity Centre, would routinely advocate for the use of encryption. Lots of benefits, but particularly from your perspective in Article 19, can you give us just an overview of the benefits of encryption, and particularly in the context of activists, dissidents, and some examples? That would be fantastic.
Yes, definitely. Well, let me thank you for having me in this debate, first of all. And I think, well, so far I've enjoyed everything that's been said. And I also find myself in the difficult situation of having to confirm and endorse that this is a complex debate. It's pretty toxic. And I think, yes, my contribution today could be to sort of try to unpack a few issues, especially in the dominant narrative, and try to bring a few examples that I do believe we need to consider in the debate, because as has been already rightly pointed out, at the very end is a matter of the kind of trade-off we want to agree about. So yeah, I was actually very interested in what Emily just said, because she said it's a power struggle in between the governments and the corporation. I do believe that it's when it comes to power, it's also a matter of trying to find the right balance in between the power that government holds and the power that people should be allowed to have about their own existence. Sometimes we're not talking about privacy only, we're not talking about free expression only, but there are a number of human rights, and sometimes we're very much talking about your own identity or our own identity, and how and if we are allowed to exist and be safe. So yes, for us, this is a very interesting and fundamental topic. We do have a few examples. I'll try to list a few and perhaps add a couple of comments or a couple of messages that we can try to get from those examples. Starting from ourselves as Article 19 researchers or policy officers, or and I mentioned Article 19, but I'm sure it's pretty similar for all the civil society organizations, depending on where we work and the topics we work on. Many of us wouldn't be allowed, or would it be, for many of us, it wouldn't possible to do research, to do our work, to dig deep or as deep as possible into certain topics, to hold communication safely, to be able to perform our daily job really, without exposing ourselves to a great risk if we wouldn't be able to use end-to-end encrypted tools. And in fact, I have to say that the last decade or so has seen an increase in the kind of digital security that we can allow ourselves to use when we do this kind of work. So definitely for human rights activists and researchers, those tools are essential tools for performing our own jobs. That's the only way to see it, I guess. We're not the only community, we're not the only group that needs this kind of tools on a daily basis. We can think, well, an obvious other group is journalists and their sources, and it's pretty clear to everyone that journalists, they will need, if journalists wouldn't be able to set secure and private channels of communication with their sources, and if they weren't able to store materials in a safe and secure and private way before they decide to go public and uncover important stories, then most probably they wouldn't be able to do their job. Many sources, they will simply withdraw, not being able to guarantee minimum security or safety for themselves. And also we need to consider this in a broader perspective. So journalists and sources would feel a lot of pressure before the moment they decide to go public. So at the very beginning of their path. And this will most probably discourage many of them or make their life impossible. On the other side, it would also change the balance of power in between the targets of their story and them. And what happens very often is that there is already an imbalance of power in between these two categories. So not being able to do that privately and safely along the way would make this almost impossible, if not totally impossible. The costs would be very high. So those are, for example, two big categories of people, but there are many others. There is the Lgbtqi minority, for example. In many areas of the world, those communities, they do rely on digital systems for their communication, for both sharing information, connecting with other people in their communities, and trying to have safe conversations, but also to access information. Think about teenagers that they need to get access to information about their sexuality or the risks or dangers that they run in certain environments or in certain situations. Or think about, yes, again, teenager or children that they are located in contexts, even families, that would put them at risk, their safety at risk if they decide to come out, for example. For those communities, having this kind of tools is again essential because it's their identity in itself that might be criminalized or attacked. So this is the only way they have to protect themselves. And it's not a coincidence that in those environments, the reliance on digital tools is up to 80–85%, while in general, for what I said, for in communications, etc. But in general, we set the mainstream population, it's in between 50 and 60%. I think there are also plenty of other examples. I just need to cut this list at some point, but let me put forward another one, which might pass unnoticed in other contexts. I recently had a discussion with a colleague from Brazil, and there are a number of civil society organizations that have helplines for women that suffer domestic violence. The only way you can convince these people to report what they're suffering is to give them an encrypted channel of communication. Without this, there will be no trust whatsoever. There will be no possibility to protect those people. So in those situations, once again, it's absolutely essential to consider that encryption does protect. And encryption is not only a matter of privacy, it can be very much a matter of public safety as well. So this is the initial conversation. I do believe that we do have already a lot of international standards, international human rights standards recognize encryption as a powerful tool. The GDPR does as well. I'm happy to go into more details about this later on. But I really wonder if sometimes the narrative is it's oversimplified, and how we can contribute to make it a little bit more unpacked and more complex, but in a way that is still allow the general public to get into this conversation and to see the different nuances and to participate properly. It's not, I'm strongly convinced, it's not only a debate in between government and companies. The general public needs to be empowered to participate. I'll stop here, and I'm happy to go into more details later on.
Thank you very much, Isa, and really powerful examples, and particularly the last one that you mentioned about women suffering domestic abuse and violence in Brazil, and the way that in the online environment where we can't really see or particularly be confident that the person on the other end of our communication is who they say they're going to be, that encryption has very much taken on that role of a proxy for trust, as you mentioned. And maybe this is something that we will explore later. Yes, absolutely. As you say, we can come back to the role of laws and whether they're also acting in the best way, or whether they are themselves a sort of fragmenting force. But first, let me turn to you, Stevie. Now we've heard the sort of the background of encryption from Kieran, and the sort of the issues that it gives rise to about the power dynamics between governments, between corporations, and as Isa reminded us, people, and also the many benefits of encryption, whether it's for activists, journalists, women, minorities, children exploring their sexuality. But from your perspective as a long-serving law enforcement officer stationed within Europol and now in your environment, I often hear law enforcement people talking about the internet going dark. Has that been your experience? And could you just give us some examples of the impact that the growing prevalence of end-to-end encryption has had on investigations? Thank you.
Thanks, Emily, and Kieran and Luisa have actually articulated this really well about the debate. I'll leave that till later on in discussion, but certainly my evolution, firstly, 30 years as a detective in Scotland, I remember the earliest forms of encryption, drug dealers using code words to describe types of drugs, cannabis, heroin, how to disclose their profits on it. That was my first exposure as a young detective in Glasgow to that. Fast forward through 30 years in Scotland, I saw that increase in use in serious organised crime, counter-terrorism, and most particularly, as Kieran mentioned, in relation to child sexual exploitation. The fortunate thing back then, probably 10, even 15 years ago, encryption was difficult. Luckily, many of our criminals weren't particularly clever and understood how to actually implement encryption. That was the world that was then. Things were much more simple. Fast forward 4 years working at Europol and the European Cybercrime Centre from 2016. I was really fortunate to become exposed to some of the European experts and indeed global experts on encryption and decryption, because the problems we started to see on a daily and weekly basis were focused round about this. All of a sudden, we had the creation of apps, end-to-end encryption that required no human interaction whatsoever. You just pressed a button and the device or the program did it for you. That's where the problems started to become really, really significant for it. And there's two aspects to this. Firstly, looking at data at rest. Data on devices that you have recovered, generally lawfully under a judicial warrant. Very important to understand that. And the second part is in relation to data in transmission and the interception of communications. And I'll probably stay away from that just now. But on a practical level, over the last 2 to 3 years, we've seen some of the huge criminal abuse of encryption. I think it's important for me to state at the start, I'm a huge proponent of encryption. Now 2 years in the private sector, looking at it, if we encrypted everything we had, we wouldn't be in the mess we are sometimes in society today with the amount of data out there. But for me, the problem is the criminal abuse of encryption. I'm looking at what we've seen in the last 2 years, the encrypted programs, end-to-end services, EncroChat, Sky NCC, Phantom Secure, where we've seen huge international global criminal networks utilising these devices to commit all forms of crime, right down to murder, torture, abduction, etc. That's what we're dealing with. And I know often in the debate with many of my friends from this who stand on the privacy side of the argument, they say that the child protection side is the emotive hand grenade that gets thrown in there. But the reality is, what I've seen on a European and global basis, we've seen some very, very clever people in these groups. They understand the implications of being caught. They have wholesale adopted the move into privacy chat rooms. They make it extremely difficult for any form of law enforcement detection in there. I've seen some of the conversations that go on in these groups about how to encrypt, how to avoid detection. They understand they're looking at 20 to 30 years in the jail. They will use every part of technology to do that. And that's forced things to become more and more difficult for law enforcement. But once again, there's probably two aspects to this. The law enforcement stance we had was not about breaking encryption. It was about cracking passwords. And again, the beauty there sometimes is that the human factor is what you can break. We're never going to be able to, at law enforcement level, break encryption, but we can break passwords. Luckily, most human beings use something that is relevant to them, and that psychology of the password is a hugely important part of what we try to do. But ultimately, if we see nowadays with the emergence of password managers, etc., that becomes increasingly difficult for law enforcement. But I would like to take the argument back slightly. And again, I think the Apple versus FBI, the going dark debate has been well covered. Most people on the call will understand what's happened there. I would like to take this back, hundreds of years ago. You look at the idea of social contract, Hobbes and Rousseau, and the idea that you give up some of your freedoms for the protection of the state. And a huge part of that is law and order and the judiciary. The judiciary being the ones who actually make those difficult decisions about freedoms versus safety and security. The big challenge I have now is that we seem to have great tech, large tech industry actually leading and driving the debate and setting the standards on this. In a normal life situation, if a judge tells me, Stephen Wilson, you will do this or you will go to jail. If I don't do that, I go to jail. What we see a situation now is where we have industry openly standing up to the judiciary and saying, no, we can't do this, or we are unable to do this because of the technology. And that's why I welcome these debates. I think so many of the debates we see in the media are actually focused on the 10% of people from one side who say we should have access to everything, and 10% of the people who say you should have access to nothing. To me, that 80% in the middle are the important people to have discussions with. If we can bring these groups 10% closer together through debates like this, that is where ultimately we can get to a solution. Because what we need to have is a situation where in society, we have a safe and secure society to protect victims of crime, but also to enable the safety of what Luisa spoke about regarding people from groups who have been targeted, investigative journalists. And it's hugely, hugely complex. But I think, again, that's the huge importance of what we're trying to do here today. And I welcome the question and answer session. Back to you, Emily.
Stevie, thank you so much for that, and to hear your perspective about, and I love that framing of the abuse of encryption by certain bad actors, because often in these debates we get this sort of one side saying, encryption bad, and the other saying encryption good. And also this sort of you'll have people on the margins who will never change their opinion, but they're I'm already quite struck by how civil this debate has at least started. But all of you have mentioned the growing prevalence of child sexual abuse materials, and online, and the online environment, the use and abuse of encryption in that context. We're very fortunate here today to have Ian Drennan from the We Protect Global Partnership, and also I would really recommend the 2021 Global Threat Assessment that you've published there. But Ian, we're seeing a generation now, and this really comes through in that Global Threat Assessment, young adults who've never known any any different environment. These are adults who've grown up, young adults who, as that children, had access to very super fast broadband, rich services, an array of different things. And some of the statistics that come through in that report are really horrifying. And the stories of young adults and what they experienced as children, maybe you could take us through some of that and what you're seeing as from your perspective in child protection. How does encryption, the prevalence of encryption, hamper your work or cause the spread or enable the spread of these child abuse images?
Thank you very much, Emily. And sort of the part of the privilege and the challenge of speaking last is that a lot of the speakers have made some of the points much more eloquently than I could have. But the privilege is I can sort of build on some of those. I really resonated with me what Sivi said about child sexual abuse and exploitation being a sort of emotive hand grenade. And sometimes I've seen when there's debates online, someone will throw in the Simpsons meme, why don't we think of the children? And I think what we need to do is to try and to take that polarization out of the equation and look at encryption as a tool. It's a tool that can be used as Isa said, for tremendous benefits. But I think it's also important to recognize it can be used to cause harm. So in our global threat assessment, when we're looking at methodology of abusers, of offenders who are trying to groom children to commit abuse, what we're seeing is them trying to move that conversation onto an encrypted platform. What we're seeing is offenders are very alive to the fact that there are some platforms that are much safer for them to use than others. And within the assessment, we've got some analysis looking at the dark web, fora there, where offenders are talking about how best to carry out abuse, and 33% of those exchanges were around what platforms to use. 15% were around what we're calling secure tooling, and 13% around content storage and exchange. So there is a sort of sophisticated understanding of what are the right tools to use, and a lot of those tools, they come right off the shelf. They don't require great technical expertise to use. I think what we're seeing, we've spoken a lot to law enforcement about this, is that there's a risk that by moving to end-to-end encryption on a large scale, and absolutely not hiding from the fact that the genie is very much out of the bottle and these tools are already out there and being widely used. But proliferation of these capabilities could make it much harder for us to see the scale of detectable child sexual exploitation and abuse online. So the risk is we move to a kind of see no evil, hear no evil phase, where we don't know the scale of the problem that we're trying to address. Now, what we're seeing at the moment, that's not going to magically go away. We just won't be able to see what's going on. And in a crime which has historically been very underreported and described as a hidden harm, that's a big problem and could end up with a vicious circle, because the less you're able to justify the scale of the problem, the more resources will fall, the less tools you're going to have, and less expertise you're going to have going into that. It's likely to complicate investigation by law enforcement, because applications for warrants won't be able to cite the content of communication. So you'll be looking at metadata and other indicators that point to probable suspicious activity, but that's usually insufficient to meet the threshold required for a search warrant. And there's examples of that with specific cases whereby it's not only reducing the likelihood of individuals' offences being detected, but also getting access to the messages that provided evidence to convict them. And I think that there's also the detection of abuse in non-encrypted environments by reducing access to the child sexual abuse material that's required to train classifiers and tools that detect illegal content. So that's another facet. But I think fundamentally, so we exist as a global alliance, which has we have tech companies on board, we have governments, we have civil society. We exist as a place where all of those elements who have an interest in taking action on this crime can come together and work out solutions. I think we need to be having, as was brought out from all of the speakers, I think this is a sophisticated debate. This is not black and white. There are two ways of looking at the problem. So LGBTQI teenagers, yes, they will get huge value out of using encrypted technology to be able to explore sexuality, look at materials, communicate. But conversely, the research that we commissioned from Economist Impact shows that it's exactly those groups that are more likely to be subject to online harms and exploitation. So it's important to look at the issues in the round. No one is saying, least of all me, sort of encryption is a bad thing. Encryption is a tremendously good thing. There's tremendous benefits. But we need to, I think, look at it, look at the risks, and have a sophisticated conversation about what are the trade-offs we're prepared to make as a society, and also recognize that these technologies are already out there, are already playing out in the policy and the law enforcement space. So how do we address that? I think sophisticated child sexual abuse offenders are already going to be using encrypted tools. I think that's something we need to recognize. We can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. What we need to do is to think innovatively and creatively about how we can grip this issue in a collaborative way.
Yeah, thank you very much. And we've had a really broad introduction to the subject from our speakers, and I'm delighted to see so many questions coming through in the Q&A already. Before we turn to your questions, and conscious that we're going to that Kieran has to leave us just before the end of the debate, could I turn to you with a question? You ended with a quote from I think the Home Secretary about seeking to preserve the integrity of end-to-end encryption while also providing access. You yourself suggested, this might not be possible. Can we have our cake and eat it? There do seem to be a proliferation of suggestions, whether it's the Apple's now withdrawn approach on the hashing of and scanning for child abuse images. What would, given that in Ian's words, that the toothpaste is out of the tube, what do we do about this? Do we just give up and say, well, too bad, we should just give up on trying to do this? Can we work with the tools that we have and work around the issue?
Well, this is the big question, and it's largely, frankly and sadly, because it means the public debate is even harder. It's quite a technical one. So I think we've all spoken about toxicity in this debate, and this has been anything but. It's been pragmatic and constructive. And it leads you to, if you like, a declaratory philosophical point, which is essentially encryption and end-to-end encryption being, the most contentious aspect of it, is by and large a public good that is willfully misused by a small but extremely damaging minority of people. And so the ideal situation is to find ways of maintaining the integrity of the tool for the vast majority of safe users, whilst finding ways of ensuring that law enforcement capability is protected. And that's certainly where, ignoring some of the noise, that's certainly where many sensible governments have got to politically. But at the same time, politics and governing is full of potentially irreconcilable objectives. Here in the UK, we're having a discussion in economics about the rising cost of living, and will it be possible to keep inflation under control whilst at the same time maintaining the low levels of interest rates that many people have enjoyed for a certain period of time? Well, plenty of economists will tell you that that's what one of those things is going to have to give. And what I think has been slightly disappointing about the last few years in the debate, for those of us, I think everyone on this panel would count themselves as part of this, is the pace of the sort of, or certainly the pace of transparent technical work to try and bridge this gap. So I look back at, say, November 2018, when I was still in government, and one of my deputies and another senior official from GCHQ published a blog in the US publication Lawfare about principles for an informed encryption debate. Now, a lot of people on the civil liberties side jumped on one particular suggestion in it, which I will paraphrase as they did, called a ghost protocol. But aim off that and just look at the 6 principles. They were perfectly sensible. But the point then is, what is the technical work to underpin that, to see if it's actually possible. So it comes down to a point, frankly, is there a way of, given that the genie is out of the bottle, is there a way of doing this? So, Ian's right, definitely about that. I also think, encrypted services are being widely used by all sorts of people. I won't embarrass individuals, but, when I look at my address book on my phone, given where I used to work, and look at the number of serving senior government people from all across the world who are using Signal, and not just on Signal, but using it, it's an attractive service for people who use it passively, i.e. people who just sign up to services that they hear are quite good and quite secure and don't think too much more about it. But actually, well-intentioned senior office holders in this country and elsewhere are making informed decisions that they think using end-to-end encryption is safer. So we're not going to abolish it, despite there was some misreporting of something that former Prime Minister Cameron said in Washington in January 16 that implied the UK government wanted to ban encryption. But if you permit me, I'll look at sort of 3 different examples quickly of attempts to put some technical flesh on this. So there's the Apple proposal, which they've now suspended, for so-called client-side scanning. And I'm not an expert on this, but essentially it involves going to, detecting through hashes on devices, whether there's large amounts of child imagery on it, and so on. And I can see the attraction of that, although, as I noted, they've suspended the implementation, and a number of eminent cryptographers have published a technical paper saying that there are serious concerns about how that might be exploited by others. So it's the same point. There's quorum key escrow. In other words, you hold a central key in a small number of trusted people. The argument against that is obvious. If something does not exist, it cannot be corrupted. If something does exist, however carefully it is managed, it can be corrupted, etc. And then there's the proposal by, amongst others, in Capitol Hill, Senator Burr, which is not a technical proposal, but it's basically the Cromwellian sort of approach: just establish a duty to make law enforcement detectable. In other words, you can't design your services. But again, critics on the other side of the debate would say, well, that's just a backdoor law, that there has to be a backdoor or a door. Sometimes it's not helpful to talk about backdoors. You're actually talking about whether there should be a door at all or not. So there's a point about, is it technically possible? There's then a point about whose job is it to prove that it's technically possible. And here I think governments are in danger of perhaps ducking the debate in a way that I don't think they'll get away with. So at the minute, frankly, and certainly in the UK perspective, it's, and this is where some of the noise comes in, it's to shout at companies, imply that they're evil and don't care about child abuse, and tell them they have to do something about it. And let's just, even some of these companies are wildly unpopular at the moment. Let's just look at that from their perspective. They have customers all over the world, including in vulnerable people in many different countries for many different reasons. And they say, look, so the obvious thing for us to do as a provider is end-to-end encryption. And the government is shouting at us and saying, don't do it, or there's a way, but we've spent millions, we've consulted all sorts of experts, and we can't find a way. But the government's still telling us to just try harder. I certainly think that if governments genuinely believe technically that an acceptable compromise is possible, well, they should probably say a bit more about that rather than just insist that one is possible. In a sense, I would like a technical version of the Lawfare blog to say, here's how these principles could be securely enacted in a way. And not everyone would agree, but there may be some reasonable people on the other side. I don't think governments can duck the debate. That's why I don't really like the Senator Burr proposal, just a general duty. If government, some eminent people on the privacy side of the debate essentially would characterize the UK government's position as the search for alchemy. And the UK government saying alchemy, finding a middle ground between these two positions is technically possible. But no government that I know is actually saying, here's how. And I think there's more that if government really believes this, then it should say more as to how. So there's a bit of that debate to run. Then finally, if there is a proposal that commands some sort of broad acceptance, then great. If there isn't, I think you're into a really hard debate, and I think it perhaps needs a lot of honesty on both sides. Firstly, although as you can probably tell from my recent remarks, I have more sympathy for the privacy side of the argument, not least because than I might have had in the past, and certainly than I would have been allowed to express when I'm representing the UK government. I have no truck at all with people who say to those on the other side of the debate, oh, you're playing the child protection card. Well, if they are playing the child protection card, it's because it's a very real and valid concern. So, if that side were to win the debate, a compromise having proved impossible, there is, in my view, a solemn duty on them to help mitigate the loss of accesses and enforcement in the way, in a gracious and graceful way. I think it's, as Ian said, when the memes, think of the children come up, I find that really offensive actually on that side of the debate. It's a real problem. But on the other hand, if the government is going to say, if the government is going to say, no, we're going to compel you, I think the government's got to be honest about that. It's going to say, no, we don't believe in the full right to privacy. There are limits to how safe we want communications to be, because we have to put in place mitigations for law enforcement, and we cannot guarantee, and they should stop pretending they can, we cannot guarantee that such mitigations can only be used by good people acting under lawful authority, because because the failure to find a technically acceptable compromise would mean that that is not true. So if there is a compromise, great. If there's not, somebody's going to win. That side needs to win with grace and accept that there are real damages. If it does come to a binary choice, there is going to be a net outcome. There will be good and bad on both sides, and you have to help mitigate the bad.
Thank you very much, Kieran. And I've given you sort of more of the floor than the usual back and forth, just just recognizing that you have to leave us early, but we have got a ton of questions from our participants. So rather than enjoy myself by asking my questions, I'm going to throw some of these fantastic questions to you. We've talked quite a bit about technology developments already, so I'm going to start actually with there's been a couple of questions about the perspective from developing countries. So I want to sort of take that first of all. In developing or underdeveloped countries, what policies are necessary to ensure children are given the attention they need to develop good cyber practices as technology proliferates? And there's another question, again, sort of encouraging us to take the debate outside of the US, UK, and Europe. How are non-democratic countries like China and Russia approaching encryption? and for you, Stephen, as part of this, could you come back to this point that you mentioned about the psychology of the password and breaking passwords? What does the human factor in encryption really mean, and how could focusing on the human factor help to fight cybercrime? So, Isa, could I turn to you first, and then Ian, and then I'll come to you, Stephen, and you can just take whichever aspects of those questions really speak to you.
Yes, sure. Well, I think my choice would stay with the second question, simply because I'm perhaps exposed to experiences in different areas. I wouldn't necessarily talk or consider only Russia and China, not because they're not good examples, but because they go way beyond that,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, I think that's
and I think it sort of links to all the debate about the technicalities and the technology and the limits for possible and concrete trade-off to the issue of governance. Because what we're talking about is actually this idea that we need to find a way for the good guys to use additional channels to detect criminal activities or activities that harm people at with different degrees and different levels. We can't assume that this is what we are talking about. When it comes to governance, and there are two things. The first one is that we need to be extremely careful about this, because once the technology is there, what we have set the possibility of doors, when we have decided that a door must be there and must be used, then the policies that each and every government would adopt in order to how to make use of these doors or these potentialities, they will change because the governments will change. So the point is that technology is going to be there, and once we open the door, we open the door, but then the government can change, and the way this door is used can change. So the point is how we can create a system that is sustainable in a way that sustain and guarantee our safety from abuses or misuses in the medium and long term. The second is we've already said so many times during this conversation that each solution will have some costs, and society will need to bear some of those costs in a way or in another. Once again, when it comes to the governance issue, the point is how we can ensure that the governance system that we put in place is actually the one that consider all the different costs, and that we get to a sort of a consensus about what kind of costs we want to bear and which we don't want to bear. And I think this also links to the mention has been done before about the social contract. I think we still need to sort of consider that the social contract is not a national security bill, but it's something that goes broader than that. And it's something that is supposed to also make sure that we can enjoy our own freedoms in the way we relate with our peers. So this is just to stress the complexity of the issue. So I do believe that the technical layer, the governance layer, and the policy layers, they're extremely interlinked. And we need to find a way to navigate these three different layers in order to have a system that secures us in the perspective.
Thank you very much.
And everywhere.
Sorry, yeah, thank you very much. And Ian, I noticed in the global threat assessment, there's a graphic which highlights the interplay between regulatory measures, technical measures, and also voluntary measures, and that very much, echoes Isa's sort of framing as well. Can I just turn to you for your comments on those questions that we heard, and particularly the perspective from developing countries as well?
Sure, and I think just what has struck me sort of as part of the wider discussion is there's a sort of mirroring there in terms of this is a tool that is subject to abuse, whether that be in terms of doors into encryption being abused by malign governments, or sort of encryption being abused by malign actors in terms of criminality. And I think again it's that trade-off there. I mean, I think to pick up the question about sort of developing world countries in the global south, I think it's absolutely essential that governments in these countries, companies operating in these countries are alive to these issues, because these are countries where digital access is growing at an incredible rate. So you're seeing leapfrogging of technology. You're getting kids who might have had no access to the internet at all, suddenly having a smartphone with the entire internet in their pocket, with all kind of incremental steps that we've been able to go through in the West, going from dial-up to broadband to mobile internet. And I think what is encouraging, what I've seen, is that in a number of countries, there is that recognition that this is coming, and some legislative measures that are taking effect. I think the challenge, and I think Lisa touched on this, is that we end up with a splinternet. We end up with a very, very complex regulatory framework internationally. And this is, the particular problem that we focus on is a global issue. You can have an offender sitting in the UK using a platform headquartered in the United States, live streaming the abuse for payment of a child in the Philippines. And you've got to look at all of the different parts of that equation to be able to try and resolve the problem. And I think just finally, looking at online education for children, I think learning how to operate online is incredibly important. But the responsibility should not be on children and caregivers solely. It shouldn't be all up to the parents. That's not, so we talk about in the assessment a pivot to prevention. That's not just about digital rules of the road. That's about companies designing from the get-go their platforms to be safe, to consider child protection as part of that design process, but also looking at some of the more politically challenging elements of that, like deterrence of offenders or offender management. That all needs to be considered, not just digital education for children. Thanks.
Now, thank you very much, Ian. Now, I kind of knew this would happen, but we've got a ton of questions and we're rapidly cantering towards the end of our time. But Stevie, can I just pose that question to you about the psychology of passwords, but also maybe you could elaborate a little bit about your comment about the way that we've allowed technology companies to set the standards, to really impose a governance model on us. So take it away, and then we're going to go into more rapid fire mode, but I do want to give you the floor on those. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to be brief, Emily. And firstly, just to sort of end on the stuff in relation to developing countries and that dependence on the companies. My worry is we've created a two-tier system here, whereby countries who can afford to, the US, UK, Europe, can buy vulnerabilities, exploits, access to tools that can decrypt these things. Now, I'm not talking about international criminality here. I'm talking about potentially local criminals who are killing people as well. These countries cannot buy the access to tools that can access these devices, and we're getting this different system. That's a real worry for me. Secondly, looking at the password psychology side of things. Now, we did training at Europol across Europe and indeed to developing countries. What we said to the cops we had coming to us, don't think right at the top, first of all. What's the most simple way? If you're searching somebody's house, many people write down their passwords or write down codes or clues towards that. Don't think about using an atomic bomb when you can use a hammer. It's that. Think simple, first of all. On many occasions, that still does work. Really important to get that across and go back to fundamentals rather than trying to use a top end. And the sort of idea, the tech companies driving the debate, it's really, really frustrating. I mean, Kieran spoke about his paper in 2018, which I thought was a really well-reasoned paper. Ian Levy was part of drafting it, and it was meant to stimulate debate. All of a sudden, the whole debate just went into a tiny focus and the whole thing was shot down in flames. That's the dispiriting part for me. And when I first became involved in the European level in 2016, I don't think the debate has moved on significantly since then. And that's the real disappointing part for me. We need to come up with some solutions. And back to this wider part, that there's no perfect solution for this. Ultimately, I think we need to risk assess to say the chances of doing, not doing, and then what's acceptable to the majority and do it. Back to you, Emily.
Thank you so much for that. I've got actually we can there's a lot of questions about things like metadata. So there's been a lot of, one question is, there's been a lot of discussion around the extent to which metadata can be used in investigations. Would someone be able to explain the current issues with using metadata? And also the private sector has different resources for decryption, such as brute force attacks, backdoors, metadata analysis, or spyware. However, how can private actors be incentivized to support public authorities in a political environment where many controversies exist with authoritarian regimes or the misuse of surveillance? Isa, could I just turn to you, and we're going into, like, you know, very rapid fire, because I want to see if we can get another round of questions in before we close today. But thank you, Isa.
Yeah, sure. I leave the issue of metadata to other people. They will definitely be more competent about this. The only thing I would like to say is that every time we talk about the metadata, we need to also consider that actually from metadata, you can also infer a lot of private information. So we need to be careful there as well. It's not that we just solve the issue by using metadata. Yes, so for this as a premise, for the other question, I think I forgot the question. I'm sorry.
It was about the sort of tools of private sector, but actually, while I've got you with the mic,
no, okay,
you can go for that one. But there's also a question which echoes some of the previous lectures in this series about, you know, before we're mandating transparency or otherwise, don't we need an international consensus? Previous lectures would seem to suggest that such a consensus would be almost unreachable, and the conversation about encryption therefore becomes something of a moot point. So I'm sure that all of you might be able to join in on that one. But yes, so private sector tools and incentives and international consensus.
I think I can provide a brief answer linking the two things. So the point is the private sector can be incentivized as much as we do have transparency about what are the public motives. So the point is, which is the public objective we want to achieve, and that's how what exactly this will show the direction for private companies. And as long as we don't have complete transparency about this and complete transparency about the unintended consequences of all this, then it's going to be difficult for private companies to even understand exactly what is asked for them, because they're going to be squeezed in between what people are asking and what they should be ensured. And or businesses, if we're talking about e-commerces, etc., we don't assume that it's always a B2C, but it can also be a B2B. And on the other side, what governments are asking. So I think that they're, again, unpacking the discourse and trying to get as much transparency as possible on the different elements, and admitting limits where the limits are there will help to find an international consensus, what you said. And I do believe that to get that, we need a multi-stakeholder discourse. We need to involve, as I said before, people, different groups and different minorities, and we need to find a common language for this conversation to go on, because it's going to be unfair and completely useless to ask people to participate in the debate if we don't find a way to explain them what's at stake. And vice versa, it's going to be useless to ask technical people with a technical background. They think mostly about efficiency and technicalities to get values in their considerations or fundamental rights into their consideration. So I think there we need to invest a lot more.
Thank you. Stevie, can I ask for your thoughts on those questions? And also I'm going to throw another one at you.
Well, I hope it's not a difficult one.
Yeah, well, let's see what you make of it, but you've got enough in there. Countries facing terrorism and insecurity have to deal with fifth columnists and saboteurs. Would you support them setting up encrypted communication channels for internal control as a means for fighting criminal activities, even if such a regime is an oppressive one? Is that... You don't have to answer that one. We could move to. I think it's a very interesting point, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's the crux of the debate. There's so many different levels to this for supporting, you know, those countries that are trying to counter something that's of criminal or serious activity, yes, I support it. But all of a sudden, if you say if that starts to support a repressive regime, that's part of the balancing act you've got to look at. That's where it becomes really challenging. On the metadata question, yeah, I know there's a lot of moves now as well to make that inaccessible, totally encrypted. I would caution on that. And again, look at the idea of what is the least intrusive means. I spoke about find the password. That's easy. There's no issue around about that. The second level for me, sometimes metadata is much less intrusive than going into communications or private matters. That sometimes can prove a case, disprove a case. But I would put the strong example of metadata often is used in cases, kidnapped victims, missing persons. Being able to access that metadata can save lives as well. So back to you for your third, more difficult question, I think.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to you now, Ian. I'm glad to see you back. I think we lost you for a couple of seconds, but yeah, that there was a very interesting question which you may have missed about, you know, even if countries are repressive, even if they're authoritarian, would you still support their use of encrypted communication in counterterrorism or in crime? And also, just this one to throw into the soup really is like, since stakeholders are entangled in the dilemma of satisfying two important and seemingly opposing goals in the issue of encryption, what's the best approach? Is there a solution that can satisfy everyone?
Those are meaty questions.
They are, you know, in 2 seconds.
In 2 seconds, of course. Well, I mean, I think the perspective we're coming from is that we are looking at ensuring that some of the most vulnerable users of the internet are able to get all the benefits of the online world in terms of communication, in terms of socialization, in terms of learning, that are available to them without the fear of exploitation and abuse. I think you know, there needs to be a global dialogue on this. I appreciate, you know, there are real challenges to getting a consensus, but I think, you know, we have the UNCRC. We've just agreed a comment on the UNCRC around digital, you know, digital rights for the child. That there is a sort of international law precedent about, you know, particular consideration of children, and I think it's not a binary between privacy and safety. What we're looking at is privacy for all. I think, and you know, and that includes children and potentially victims and survivors of abuse. And I think, you know, we need to involve, you know, there are vulnerable groups within all of these countries around the world. So I think, you know, they need to be part of the conversation. We can't, you know, and that's the approach we take. We don't exclude governments because we recognize the needs of the children that are within those governments, that are within those countries. Sorry.
Thank you. We're just out of time, but I'm going to I'm going to ask each of you, just looking ahead to the next year or two, can you, in like 1 or 2 words, tell me the answer to the question from your perspective? I know we're winning. I know we'll be winning when something happens. Is that clear? Stephen, can I start with you?
Oh, thanks for that, Emily. For me, debate, listen, reason with each other, and let's reach not a complete consensus, but agree a way forward in relation to this. Back to you.
Thank you. Ian.
I know we'll be winning when we're talking in terms of practical solutions and we're having a positive conversation about balances and trade-offs.
Thank you, Ian. Isa.
I think I need to partly echo that. The best win is when we're going to get free of these eventually false dichotomies or binary solutions. And as we've discussed, there might be a few ways to do that. Hopefully so.
Thank you so much, all of you, and to Kieran who had to leave early, but Maria, Luisa, Stevie, Ian. I think this has been an incredibly constructive debate on a polarizing and polarized issue. I would like to thank all of you for your contributions today. Also, for all of the attendees of the webinar and the live stream for your excellent questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. We'd need a bit more time for that, but great to have those questions and the participation. So at this point, I'm going to close the live stream session with thanks to everybody. And I'd like to hand